Hola, so we're about to come to the grand finale of shamatha within the Buddhist tradition, not just this little sequence. Right into just sleek, unelaborated shamatha without a sign, which is really a matter when you just come down to the slimmest version, which will be the culminating phase. It's much more a practice of discovering shamatha rather than achieving it or developing it. We'll get to that shortly. What I'd like to do now is use very few words for a whole lot of meaning to summarize and elaborate a tiny bit on everything that just went before. This whole sequence, because we're approaching the great perfection, which we'll get to tomorrow, and the Madhyamaka is an indispensable foundation. If you don't understand Madhyamaka, you don't understand Dzogchen. His Holiness is very clear, Dujam Lingpa is clear, and so forth. Philosophically speaking, in using your intelligence, the perfection of wisdom, the Madhyamaka is really the philosophical foundation for then going supernova and transcending concepts, transcending the intellect and into deeper realms of insight. So we will spend today in the Madhyamaka. And to summarize how we got here, and after all, we're living in the West, whatever our ethnic background, so to present this with no connection at all to Western civilization, as if Western philosophy never took place, I think is not very savvy. I think it's an exercise of ignorance, and I don't think ignorance is all that good, so I'm going to make very brief allusions. The brilliant Descartes, brilliant philosopher, brilliant mathematician, in seeking to understand reality from a platform that was indubitable, that is, what can I not doubt? He was a mathematician, so he wanted to start with an axiom that simply couldn't be reasonably doubted, and then with logic build up from that. And we're still talking about him. He must have had a lot going for him, not only as a mathematician, Cartesian coordinates, geometry. So his best shot, starting with I cognize, therefore I am. It is deeper than I think, therefore I am. And I just had this from an expert, a world-class philosopher. Is I cognize, therefore I am. I'm aware, therefore I am. That has to be taken much more seriously than I think, therefore I am. Setting that aside, that's where he started. And where he wound up with was two irreducible domains of reality, and I'm not quite sure of the pronunciation, so I think you know better than I, John. Res cogitans, is that how you pronounce it? Okay, we'll say it, but you can imagine the spelling. Res cogitans, from the Latin, and the res extensa, that one I remember. The res cogitans is basically the realm of the mind, cognition, knowing, and then res extensa is the physical world, that which is extended in space, so atoms, fields, and so forth. And so everything boils down to this, a fundamentally ontologically, or let's say dualistic metaphysical realism, that nothing is omitted if you boil everything down to irreducible mind, and he didn't say it, but he meant it, inherently existent, an irreducible and inherently existent domain of space and all the stuff in it, which is the physical. And that's what everything boils down to. Mind and matter, Cartesian dualism. And we're still talking about it. But what the materialists will point out, and they're right, is that it didn't work. It doesn't work. It's a car with no wheels, in the sense that he had no idea whatsoever that made any sense out of just sheer speculation of how do you connect the two? How does the mind interact with the machine, the body, and how does the body interact with the ghost, the spirit, esprit of the mind? He didn't have an idea. I mean, he just speculated that it comes in by way of the pineal gland, but with no compelling reason at all. It never stood up. So he explained, and yet he explained nothing, because if you can't explain how mind and matter interact, then you've not explained anything, because they clearly do. So the materialists point out, if you're Cartesian dualist, you've been failing for 400 years, why don't you give it a rest? It didn't work, and it didn't. For 150 years, we've had materialism. Said, okay, we just fired Descartes, you're finished, you failed, you couldn't do the job. We're coming in from the time of Thomas Huxley, been dominating ever since, that everything boils down to matter, the emergent properties of matter. They've had 150 years. Pointing always back, Descartes didn't work, and give us more money. Really, give us more money. As the neuroscientists persuaded Obama to give him 100 million every year, because if we map the brain, we'll know everything we need to know about the mind. Well, they've 150 years, and Donald Hoffman pointed out, we've made no progress at all. You have no explanation whatsoever how mind even comes into existence, what it is, what is consciousness. You've made no progress, and so I'm sorry, you're fired. I mean, 150 years with all your brilliance and all the money we gave you and all the technology, you've made no progress at all, so give it a rest. Yes, Descartes fired, we're not going back to him, but Thomas Huxley and company, all you are saying mind is simply a function of the brain, you've never demonstrated it, you've just expressed a belief, like a religious believer. That's not science. You failed. You have no explanation for qualia, no explanation for consciousness, don't know how the mind interacts with the brain. You've had 150 years and billions of dollars. I'm sorry, you're fired, right? We go to Chittamatra. Equally, we can just pause briefly at Sautrantika. It's not metaphysical dualism, it's metaphysical pluralism. Pluralism, you remember, because it's not just mind and matter, there's that whole other category. But they have no explanation when they say you're perceiving the external physical world by way of appearances. What's that external world really? Because all you have is appearances, and you have no explanation. Chittamatra says, Sautrantika, you've had 1,500 years, you're fired. You couldn't deliver the goods. You can't tell us anything about that physical world outside of appearances. It's a black box, you actually don't know anything at all, you're fired. That's not a complete description, I'm sorry. And then we go to Chittamatra, I said, okay, now we're real, we're dealing with something we really do know, appearances and the mind, and Madhyamaka says, you've just thrown out the external physical world because it's unfindable, I dare you. Show that the mind that knows, that observes, show that it's any more findable than that external physical world. Show me. Show me any explanation for really all of the tremendous amount of knowledge acquired by modern science. Explain that in terms of karma. How do you explain the inverse square law of gravity in terms of karma? I don't think so. Chittamatra, you're fired. Your mind is no more findable than the external physical world, and so you didn't cut it either. Then it's Madhyamaka. And it's coming back to the thinnest of ice. But here's that point, and this is where I'm going to stop, but it's really, really big. The Madhyamikas, Prasanga in particular, say that if things did inherently exist, whether it's Adam's fields, whether it's physical phenomena, or whether it's mental phenomena, mind, thoughts, consciousness, if things really did exist by their own inherent nature, nothing could causally interact with anything else. Because they would be hermetically sealed. Each would have its own identity, its own contours, its own borders. It would exist by its own inherent nature, independent of anything else, which means nothing could, it's not obvious, but if you look deeply enough, I'm just saying it, if things exist in that way, nothing could interact with anything else, because each one would have its own immutable, hardcore essence of what it really is, the Ding an sich. So if things existed like that, everything would be frozen. You'd have a whole bunch of self-existent little chunks of mind and particles and fields. But mind would never know the physical world because it would be inherently separate. The physical world would never be accessible to the mind or influenced by the mind because they're inherently separate. And all those atoms and particles could never interact because they're inherently separate. And so, if you're a metaphysical realist, you have no explanation for causality, for anything influencing anything at all. And by a process of elimination, once you've thrown out this and that and the other, the only thing standing is the middle way. Is that true or not? Well, we'll look into that this afternoon. But I think they really have demolished everything else. I think so. And so this either makes sense or you can figure out what else makes sense. Now we go to the meditation. And I wanted to just add a one-liner from the Buddha, because in Padmasambhava, in this sequence, natural liberation, which I've cited in our notes, this is the culmination. There's not, in terms of shamatha, there's nothing beyond, nothing more subtle, nothing more profound than this final phase we're about to begin. But to connect this with a Pali Canon, and this will be extremely brief, I mean literally, it's one sentence, and then we'll go to the meditation. It's back there among the 10 kasinas, earth, water, fire, air, yellow, red, blue, and white? Four primary, white, four primary colors, four elements, space and consciousness. And so consciousness, well, this is what the Buddha had to say, and I have not found any commentaries, but I think Padmasambhava provides a commentary. Centuries later. Here's what the Buddha said about the 10th kasina, which is the most profound one and the simplest one. One reviews the emblem, the kasina of consciousness, above, below, transversely, undivided, all permeating. Very brief commentary that I can actually say I know what I'm talking about, that is, what I'm about to say is true. When for any of the other kasinas, like the earth kasina, with the earth kasina, it's very clearly described in that book, Buddhist Theory and Meditation. It's right there, very clear. The antecedent for that, Visuddhimagga, Path of Purification, also a free download. You take basically an emblem of the earth element, like basically a dirt pizza or a clay pizza, a round disc, and that's your emblem, that's your token to represent, to symbolically represent the whole of the earth element throughout the universe, anything that is solid and firm. This will do. This is an instance. It's an emblem, it's a token. And you focus on that visually. It's just a chunk of clay, a little disc, a little pizza of clay, but that's your emblem. And then you go from that to an acquired sign, which is purely mental, and you go from that to the counterpart sign, which is the archetype, the archetypal form of earth element throughout the universe as it is present in the form realm, and all manifestations of solidity throughout all galaxies are all expressions or effulgences of that archetype. Similarly then, he's still using the same word, emblem. So what's your emblem of consciousness as a fundamental constituent of the universe? Big, like earth element throughout the entire universe or multiverses. What's your emblem? What can you start with that you can actually focus on, like a dirt pizza? What you can focus on is the consciousness of which you're aware right now. That's not universal consciousness, that's not even substrate consciousness, but it's a start. And it's not something other than, any more than that dirt pizza is something other than earth element. Well, it is earth element, it's just a little token of it. So he says, one reviews the emblem of consciousness. The consciousness you can observe right now, you view that. But then, above, below, transversely, and so forth, you take that emblem, which can seem when you start to be small, like the earth pizza. It's like maybe, like a medium-sized pizza, maybe 12 inches in diameter. There it is, you look at it. And your little consciousness, your little human consciousness, you look at that, your little emblem. But then you expand it. He says you review it, expanding up and below transversely. You literally expand the space of your awareness through exercise. That's what Padmasambhava is about to guide us in doing. Okay? So, and this was in Pali. This was never, I've never seen this translated into Tibetan, but there it is, his core pith instructions, the Buddha's, on going from the emblem of consciousness to achieving jhana, achieving shamatha in consciousness, which means you cut through the emblem and you cut through the form of consciousness in the form realm, and that's a substrate consciousness. Or at least it's on the cusp, it's right on the cusp, that substrate consciousness. So you go from the localized, the individual, to the substrate consciousness, which when you ascertain, when you achieve shamatha, you have actually, by definition, when you achieve shamatha, you achieve access to the first jhana, which means you cross the threshold over into the form realm, the realm from which this whole reality emerges. So as for the earth, water, fire, air, when you cross the threshold from your human mind, your coarse human mind that arises independence upon human brain, and you cross the threshold, then you're tapping into a dimension of consciousness, still individuated, but in the form realm. And it is from that, one can say then, archetypal consciousness in the form realm, that all manifestations of mind in the desire realm, hell, preta, animal, human, asura, deva, in the desire realm, all of those are manifestations of substrate consciousness. So, going very deep, very simple, let's do it. And I've added this to your notes. Settle your body, speech, and mind. We enter the main practice as we have done before, with the eyes open, awareness evenly resting in the space in front of you. Awareness resting right where it is. Nowhere in physical space, not inside your head or anywhere else. Just resting where it is, without being directed anywhere. Self-knowing, self-illuminating. Sustained without distraction, without grasping. There's awareness, mental awareness, and there's the space of mental awareness, the space of which mental awareness is conscious. We call it the relative Dhamma Dhatu. Awareness and space. How big is the space of awareness? How big is the Dhamma Dhatu? So the first exercise here, exactly following the words of the Buddha, is focusing on the awareness of which you can be aware, the emblem of much deeper dimensions of awareness. Start where you are with what you have. And now do direct your mental awareness, your attention. Direct it up into the space above you. It's the space of awareness. Focus your attention direct. Your attention as far up into space above you as you can imagine. How do you do this? It's not by visualizing, like a ray of light going up and up and up and up. That's just a visualization. So we're not visualizing something. But we are directing our awareness upwards as far as we can. So the closest analogy is if I should ask you, listen very closely to a very distant, very faint sound that's coming from directly above your head, but very, very far away. Can you hear it? This distant, faint sound coming from directly above. As you can direct your mental awareness up into the auditory field to see if you can hear this sound that is coming from a very distant place without visualizing anything. You can do that. In a similar way now, without any reference to sound, simply, but in the same way, direct your awareness up into space as far as you can reach. Expand the space of your awareness above you by bringing your attention to it. How high? How far? Bearing in mind that you can imagine the lines of the Milky Way, light years up into space. And those lines connecting the dots are in the space of your awareness, nowhere else. Your mental awareness. I think I said Milky Way, I meant the Big Dipper. But now relax. Relax, utterly let awareness descend right where it is. Rest for a moment simply in the awareness of awareness. And now in the same way, extend your awareness, your mental awareness. Propel your attention out into the space of awareness to your right as far as you can imagine. Go into deep space to the right. And relax, effortlessly. Let your awareness rest right where it is. Self-knowing, the same way now, cast your awareness out into the space to your left. This open, vast, limitless expanse of awareness itself. The space of awareness. And relax. From this place of rest, of effortlessness, ease, just for a moment, check in. Is there a sense of there being an observer that just came to rest? What is your sense of the mind as observer? What comes to mind? We're about to go downwards into space. If you choose to do so, it will be the mind that does so, that casts awareness downwards into the space of awareness beneath. What is that mind that will do it? The agent? That decides whether or not to do it, and then perhaps decides yes, and then does it. What's doing it? What's deciding? Then cast your awareness downwards. Not into physical space, nothing solid beneath you, downwards into the space of awareness. With no borders, no limits. As far as your awareness can reach. And then relax. Let your awareness remain wherever it is when it's not directed anywhere. resting in its own place, holding its own ground. If you still have a residual sense based on sheer habit and nothing else, that your mental awareness, the locus of your mental awareness is inside your head, if you still think that's where it comes to rest, a superstition, but a persistent one, then I invite you to close your eyes to make the next step maybe a bit easier. And as if you were stepping into an elevator from the third floor of the building and hitting the B button for basement, and then descending, see if you can let the locus of your awareness, the place from which you feel that you're viewing, see if you can just let it descend. Release it. Right down in the elevator from your head, right down to the heart chakra in the center of your chest. And let your awareness descend, come to rest in your heart, so that you feel that's where you're looking out from. That's where awareness comes to rest, in your heart. Do your best. As I mentioned before, when you achieve shamatha, and your mind collapses into the substrate consciousness, that substrate consciousness is strongly correlated with the subtle prana, or vital energy, which descends from the head down to the heart. When your mind dissolves into the substrate consciousness, when you fall deep asleep, those pranas descend to the heart chakra. So imagine that to be the case now. Awareness with its conjoined energies descends to the heart and dwells there. And then once again, let your eyes be gently open, your gaze vacant. And now in an instant, release your mind into space. Let it merge with space, dissolve, vanish into space, the space of awareness. Every aspect of your mind, your thoughts, memories, imagination, dreams, emotions, in an instant, release every vestige of your human mind into space, external space, outside your head, outside your body. Release it there without trace. And rest in what remains. Simple, unconfigurated awareness. And rest there, doing nothing. And let's continue in silence. So we've come back to Shamatha Without a Sign from Natural Liberation by Padmasambhava. So you can find that in your notes. And so I'll read the rest of his explanation of this, and then you'll see what I was interpreting. You see whether I was interpreting well or bad, or not well. Here's what he said. So the last phase, it was that was that paragraph ending with, and you may even identify pristine awareness. Probably won't, but it's possible. And then he says, do as before. Okay, position your body. Now, alternately, tightly concentrate your consciousness, wholly concentrating it without wavering. And then gently release it, evenly resting it in openness. So we're back to that initial fluctuation. Concentrating in awareness in upon itself, and then releasing into openness. Again concentrate, again release. In that way, meditate with alternating constriction and release. So that's your prep. But now we're going to move into this fourth phase, or penultimate, just before the final grand finale. At times, steadily direct your gaze, and this is definitely not your eyeballs, because that would be completely useless. It would be an eye exercise. Your gaze is the gaze of your mental awareness. It has nothing to do with your eyes, so keep your eyes disengaged. But gaze, that is, attend, or we can simply say awareness, but at times steadily direct your gaze up into the sky, up into space, not physical space. Steadily focus your awareness with a desire to be without anything on which to meditate. So don't give yourself a target. Don't visualize something way up there. Just direct upwards. Like a spotlight. Like in time before, you have those big spotlights to pick up airplanes flying overhead, or it's just for fun, you're advertising. But just as far as you can. Simple. Direct the light of your awareness upwards without visualizing up there, anything up there. And so steadily focus your awareness with a desire to be without anything on which to meditate, no target, no object. Then relax again. At times, steadily, unwaveringly direct your awareness into the space on your right. At times, direct it to the left, and at times, direct it downwards. And during each session, rotate your gaze around in those directions. So I think he's advising, directing us here to do exactly what the Buddha was saying when he said upwards, downwards, and so forth. And then occasionally inquire, what is that awareness of the one who is focusing the interest? So then we're back to that which is, focusing back to agency. Who's doing that? What's doing that? It's not happening all by itself. There is an agent who is focusing the interest, the awareness, and what is that? Let the awareness itself steadily observe itself. At times, and now we move on, at times let your mind come to rest in the center of your heart and evenly leave it there. At times, evenly focus it in the expanse of the sky or space and leave it there. Thus, by shifting the gaze or the focus of your awareness in various alternating ways, the mind settles in its natural state. As indications of this, if awareness remains evenly, lucidly, and steadily, wherever it is placed, shamatha has arisen. So that's a very, how do you say, minimalist account of the achievement of shamatha, but much more detailed descriptions, accounts of mind dissolving the substrate consciousness, really unpack that. If awareness, but now we go back in process, what if you can't do this perfectly? What if you can't do exactly what he said? If awareness becomes muddled and without mindfulness, that is the problem of laxity or dimness. So clear it up, inspire it, and shift your gaze. Give it something to do. Sharpen it up a bit. On the other hand, if it becomes distracted and excited, so there are the two imbalances, laxity and excitation, it is important that you lower your gaze and release your awareness. So lower it if you fall into excitation, and elevate it or shift it around if you're falling into laxity and dullness. If samadhi arises in which there is nothing of which you can say this is meditation, and this is conceptualization, in other words, if the power of discernment, even though the mind is non-conceptual, if it becomes muddled, spaced out, is all one, can't differentiate anymore, then this is the problem of oblivion. You've just spaced out, you've fallen into deep dullness. So meditate with alternating concentration and release, and recognize who is meditating. Recognize the flaws of shamatha, the imbalances of laxity and excitation and eliminate them right away. So again, this is really entering into and getting comfortable with, abiding in a mode of sharp, crystal clear, discerning, intelligent awareness that is non-conceptual. Normally, when we're sharp, crystal clear, and discerning, that knowing is completely embedded in language, concepts, and so forth. Extremely intelligent people, mathematicians, for example, the really good ones, they're really brilliant, right? The discerning intelligence. Brilliant philosophers, the same thing, and so forth. But their brilliance, the acuity, the precision, and so forth, is all embedded in a conceptual framework. We're trying to bring here the same quality, or even a heightened quality of clarity, vividness, sharpness, acuity, powers of discernment, but transcending the lower, how do you say, I'm thinking in terms of space, like the lower stratosphere, going higher and higher, elevating beyond the familiar domain of knowing, which is again embedded in concepts, conceptual constructs, and so forth, and yet still maintain that sharpness and the power of discernment. And if you go back to the sequence, substrate, activation of karmic energy, substrate consciousness, afflictive mentation, the first point at which there is a real differentiation, distinction, being able to distinguish between this and that, is subtle mentation, and that is preconceptual. So we're rolling back the carpet from the full catastrophe, where we're totally embedded in conceptual mind, attachment, aversion, and all of that. We're rolling this back to that subtle mentation, which could be crystal clear and discerning, but it's, how do you say, is not using concepts to differentiate between this and that. That's the difference between subtle and coarse mentation. We're rolling this back, literally, we're rolling it back right to the point at which your coarse mind is dissolved and all that remains on the far side of afflictive mentation is just substrate consciousness coextensive with the substrate. So that's why some people, when they really start going deeply into this, and I've guided quite a few people now over 12 years in longish retreats, sometimes quite long retreats, they start going into this deeper, and then some fear, existential fear arises. I mean, real gut, real fear. I've heard this many times. And I say, what are you afraid of? When they report in, I don't know, but I'm really afraid. And if I push them a bit, I can probably get them to say, I'm afraid of being annihilated. I'm afraid I'm going to lose myself. Good. Face up to it and get beyond it. So if you get the point, you can't even distinguish whether your practice is going well or not, whether it's really a meditation or you're just caught up in wandering thoughts, then you really, fix it. But now he will elaborate a bit more. Flawless shamatha is like an oil lamp that is unmoved by wind. So that's my little index finger pointing up. The unflickering flame of an oil lamp or a candle, unmoved by wind. Wherever the awareness is placed, it is unwaveringly present. Awareness is vividly clear, without being sullied by laxity, lethargy, or dimness. And wherever awareness is directed, it is steady and sharply pointed. Really sounds like a laser to me. And unmoved by adventitious thoughts, it is straight. It is thus a flawless meditative state arises in one's mind stream. And until this happens, it is important that the mind is settled in its natural state. In other words, right after the end of this passage, he's going to go right into Vipassana. Now previously he said do this for 1 day, now do this for 1 day, now this do for 1 day, and now he says, this is it. There are no further phases. Once you've just released your mind into space as much as you can, and you're resting in what remains when you've released everything else, well then you're settling your mind in its natural state. You won't be able to do that perfectly the first time. So you'll be settling the mind. But as you keep on just releasing and releasing the subtler and subtler vestiges of grasping, the subtler and subtler movements of distraction, and you're settling into awareness becoming more and more unclothed, naked, unelaborated, unfiltered, then it finally comes to rest. And then it rests in its natural state. And the awareness that is resting is the substrate consciousness, and the space in which it's resting is the substrate. So we're seeking to approximate this. We sought to approximate that at the end of the last session. Release your mind, every aspect of your coarse mind, your human mind, release it. Rest in what remains, and that's your closest facsimile for, in this session, to the substrate consciousness, and the space in which it is present is your closest facsimile to the substrate. What it is, in fact, is simply your human mental consciousness and the human dharmadhatu. But okay, just shed your humanness. Shed your humanness. And no wonder you feel like you're dying. That's what happens when you die. You shed your humanness, and all that's left is substrate. Or if you get there lucidly, substrate and substrate consciousness. So, but he says now, until your mind, until this happens, until you've achieved shamatha, then don't give up, don't jump the gun, don't go off half-baked. Saying, well, that was probably good enough, what the heck, let's get into Vipassana. I'm sure it's much more interesting than this. And Dream Yoga is much cooler than this. And then Poa is much more interesting. Stage regeneration is more, everything's more interesting than this. Let's giddy up and get out of here. That's good enough, don't you think? Yeah, me too. Let's go. And that's what almost all Tibetans have been doing ever since he wrote this. Tsongkhapa said it. I'm not criticizing anybody, but Tsongkhapa said this in the 14th century. He said, nowadays, very few people achieve shamatha. I think for exactly the reason that Dujum Rinpoche said a week or two ago. They're bored with it. Let's get on with the good stuff. It was very nice having the little preamble, but how about the main event? 6 yogas of Naropa. Whew. Stage of generation and completion. But basically, everything's more interesting than this. And so hardly anybody stays around long enough, even nowadays. Hardly anybody. When I spoke with His Holiness last November, he said, nowadays, almost no one's achieved shamatha. I'm not criticizing, I'm just quoting him. He said, Tingsang, Shinri Pacheyo Mare. There's no other way to translate it. Nowadays, almost nobody's achieving shamatha. He didn't say nobody, but that's not because it's so incredibly difficult. It's just that hardly anybody's really trying. A lot of people do it for an hour or two a day and say, do it, it's really important, but now are you ready for Mahamudra? Try it for a little while. Are you ready for stage regeneration? Are you ready for Chut? Chut's cool, big drums. It's really, and I'm not really good. It's very, very deep. I have no doubt. Dujum Lingpa wrote a great big text on Chut. He would not do that if it was trivial. It's very, very deep. But can you get the full benefit without having achieved shamatha first? Nope. But people are impatient and people do get bored with shamatha. Too bad. Too bad. So this is what Padmasambhava is saying. Please never say, Alan Wallace's view is. Who cares what Alan Wallace's view is? Without genuine shamatha arising in one's mind stream, even if pristine awareness is pointed out, it becomes nothing more than an object of intellectual understanding, and one is left simply giving lip service to the view. And there is the danger that one may succumb to dogmatism. Having had some pointing out instructions some time ago, it's become a memory. But you say, I've realized Rigpa, because I did 3 years ago. And I realized Rigpa. And therefore I'm a Dzogchen practitioner. Therefore I think I'm qualified to teach. And thank goodness I'm a Dzogchen practitioner, because they're so much better than those people practicing stage of generation and completion. And the people in the Sutrayana, hi. Theravada, hi. We're so much cooler than everybody else. We have the deepest view, we have a great perfection view. It's the best. And I'm a Dzogchen master. That's all hypothetical. So that's dogmatism. When the Buddha is talking about mental afflictions, there are, to get it right, 6 primary mental afflictions and 20 derivative ones. And among the primary mental afflictions, just root causes of how come we're still stuck in samsara. One of those is, it rolls off the tongue, rangitawa chokdizimpa. It's grasping onto one's own view as supreme. Whatever it is, whether it's Marxism or Dzogchen or Christianity or Buddhism or materialism or anything else, grasping onto my view as supreme. Welcome to samsara, you've just taken out a long-term lease. And even if that view is Dzogchen, my view is Dzogchen, you may just succumb to dogmatism. That's what he's saying. Thus, the root of all meditative states depends on this. Wow. That's even bigger than Ledap Lingpa, that said this is the foundation for all samadhis of stage of generation and completion. No foundation, your building collapses, right? And now he's even, Padmasambhava is going beyond that, the rule of all meditative states. Vipassana, dream yoga, poa, chut, dumo, dzogchen. It all depends on this. This is where the root is. So do not be introduced to pristine awareness too soon. Don't run off and try to get pointing at instructions as soon as you can. But practice until there occurs a fine experience of stability. Up to this point, the instructions have concerned the practice of shamatha with and without signs. And that's his last word before going on to vipassana. So this afternoon then, we will move into vipassana. And because I think it's just so much in tune with the whole spirit of dream yoga, which is of course all about the mind, fathoming the mind from inside the cinema of a lucid dream, which is a spectacular laboratory for exploring not only the nature of mind, but just release the dream and go right into the substrate consciousness. Practice vipassana. When you're in the substrate consciousness, you know you're not bound and gagged. It's not like you can't think. Like substrate. Not like that. It's just you can rest in the substrate consciousness. If all you could do is just sit there and experience bliss, luminosity, and non-conceptuality, it would just be a nice vacation. But if you can't use it, then what's the point? As Dujum Lingpa says, you haven't even entered the path yet, if that's all you've achieved. So the whole point of this, as known everywhere in Buddhism, that you achieve access to the first jhana, or even fully achieve the first jhana, and now you have this mind that it's brilliant in the sense of all 5 jhana factors. It's single-pointed, the sense of well-being, of bliss, course investigation, subtle analysis, visualization, directing. I mean, you've got a mind now like a Olympic-class gymnast. What can't you do with your body that can be done with a human body? It is so pliable, so balanced, so buoyant, so malleable, so sharp. You want to explore past lives? Go for it. You want to visualize? Boom. Want to practice vipassana? Kaboom. You're ready to go. But this mind is now really fit for service. Lesurung is what they say. It's fit for service. It's ready to be put into action. And until then, until you've fully achieved shamatha, they describe it in Tibetan with a word that sounds bad. Really, it sounds bad. If your mind is not lesurunga, doesn't that sound cool? Lesurunga, fit for action, it's, you ready? Ningen le. That's how you say it, ningen le. It just sounds so disgusting. It sounds like, another word for durian. It smells like ningen le. Your nose wrinkles when you say it, ningen le. It means not serviceable. It means dysfunctional. It doesn't work. It's broken. Everybody hasn't achieved shamatha. Sorry. You don't get a mental bill of health. Your mind doesn't work very well. But as one friend of mine, old friend, 45-year-old friend, that is 45 years going back, we studied Buddhist logic, and we were in the monastery together 45 years ago. And then he went off and studied Tibetan medicine. And then he got an MA and then a PhD in clinical psychology, Tibetan. Old friend. And so he's got a big bandwidth there. And we were together at a medical conference, an international conference on Tibetan medicine years back. And he's speaking from his professional background as a former monk like myself and studied Tibetan medicine much more deeply than I did, and clinical psychology when I have no degrees at all. And speaking now as a very, very cross-cultural person, he said, and he's lived in America now for decades, lives in Los Angeles. Oh, and he said, having lived with Westerners, he's speaking explicitly of Americans, he said, I've been living with Americans for a long time now, or people in the West, and frankly, in terms of your prana system, you're all ill. I mean, really, you're really ill. Your prana system is so screwed up, you're all really ill. But considering how ill you are, you're coping very well. So, in terms of our prana system, same thing. Subtle body, Ningen Le. Achieve shamatha, your prana system is Le Suruma. It's streaming. And your mind is streaming. And until you achieve shamatha, your prana system, nervous system, is really like a broken down jalopy that barely makes it across the street. And your mind the same, because the two are in tandem with each other. There we are, 12:30. So, plenty to practice for the next 2 hours. But let's say, because I want to make sure you have all the time you need, see you at 2:35.